The era of AAA games is over. Like, how can any AAA developer hope to compete with Elden Ring? And that's why the era of the indie game has finally begun. Let me explain. Any game you've ever loved, doesn't matter when it came out, has probably been remade by an indie studio, and I'm following a lot of them on TikTok. Saying remade is a little deceiving. The truth is, every game can be broken down into format and mechanics. The format is where all games start, whether that's shooters, Souls-likes, or side-scrollers. These are things like camera placement and animation structures. Once you commit to a format, you can never go back. But mechanics are more like the trends you see with indie games. For me, roguelikes are the best example of this, and in some ways they actually blur the lines between mechanics and format. Maybe you've noticed more games with parrying and dodging, or even the new Batman game essentially becoming Destiny. Mechanics are things that can apply across all formats and are more easily changed. And finally, of course, I have to mention VR. Even in the short amount of time since the Oculus Quest 2 came out, VR games have absolutely exploded. And you can probably find a VR version of every game format you can think of. I want to talk a little bit about where these ideas come from, but really I'm using roguelikes and arcade games as a way to show you guys some of my favorite game formats, with a few honorable mentions for people who aren't roguelike stans. Probably the most beloved format, shooters have been a part of my life for almost as long as I can remember. You're seeing footage from Gunfire Reborn, which is easily one of my favorite roguelike shooters out there. For a lot of people, Ultra Kill is also a classic, inspiring a whole new generation of arena shooters. Plus, games like Bullets Per Minute and Superhot can turn the format on its head with game-changing mechanics. I think for a lot of people, Souls-like has lost all meaning, but I'm specifically talking about 3D fighters that have both a block and a dodge mechanic. You're seeing footage from Ravenbound, which has been a little controversial online, but I still think they did a great job of showing how to balance this format properly. This is probably the most difficult format to really do well, as melee combat games definitely take more effort in general. But when something in this format really feels good, it can be almost as addicting as Elden Ring and Wo Long. So isometric and side-scrolling games are a great way to think about indie games in general. Both formats only have 2 degrees of freedom, which makes designing them much simpler. Games like Hades and Dead Cells really gave developers a blueprint to create some truly incredible experiences that aren't super difficult or expensive. But for a player, it also reduces the stress of going from a game like Hades to Curse of the Dead Gods, which you're watching right now, because they're essentially the same game in a lot of ways. Before we get into the real honorable mentions, I'd also like to say that flight simulators and infinite runners have quickly become my favorite formats, although they're definitely much more limited. You're watching Tanuki Sunset, which is probably the best infinite runner ever created. I'm just gonna let the footage play while we talk about the actual honorable mentions. The biggest format I've seen from indie studios is just the shift towards co-op games. Grounded and Stardew Valley led to an explosion of survival games, although some are definitely more cozy than others. But there's also a bunch of really awesome story games like It Takes Two, where co-op is a core part of the game. Although I think a lot of devs realize that people really just want to play more story games with friends. And now we can talk about something that goes beyond format or mechanics. It's literally an entirely new platform. And if you have enough money for the initial investment, VR games are easily the craziest format in history. But that should be obvious to everyone. VR games may seem intimidating at first, but they're defined by one big change. In VR, you are the player. That means you're the camera, and you're also all of the animations. And in some ways, that actually makes VR games a lot more intuitive to learn. The big thing with VR right now is the cost of entry. I think a lot of companies like HTC are making smart choices by creating super high-end VR goggles that are designed for companies to purchase as a business expense. My hope is that they can use that money to fund the creation of the next era in consumer VR, the so-called Quest Killer, at $300 or less. I've mentioned it a little bit, but to close out the video, I want to shout out some of my favorite indie studios that are all on TikTok. AgroCrab is a Seattle-based studio creating Another Crab's Treasure, designed to be a more accessible entry for players who want to try the Souls-like format. Flip-Fly Games is creating Whisker Squadron Survivor, which is basically an infinite runner flight sim with some light horde survival elements. We're also mutuals on TikTok. Funktronic Labs is working on The Light Brigade, a VR roguelike shooter that does a great job of balancing realism with classic video game craziness. Smack Studio is creating a game called, well, Smack Studio. It's a platform fighter that allows players to create their own characters with custom animations. Slope Crashers is designed by a solo dev. It's a downhill snowboarding game that you can play with your friends. Plus it has tons of cute animals as the snowboarders. Mr. Kenny Sun has released Mr. Sun's Hatbox, a zany co-op roguelike that doesn't take itself too seriously and offers a new take on roguelike combat. Chris Parbury is working on It Consumes, a new take on a horde survival FPS where the only way to see enemies is to use your heartbeat like a radar. Get to the Orange Door is easily one of my favorite FPS games, with insanely fast movement and top-notch gunplay. Did I mention you can also slow down time? Thanks for watching. As always, please check out these studios if any of them caught your eye, or you can check out some of my past game reviews if any of the formats I've talked about sound exciting. As always, like and subscribe, and if you made it to the end of the video, comment your favorite indie game.